We continue now at the top of Daf Yud Ches Amud Aleph and Meseches Bava Basra. This is Bava Basra Daf 18a. This daf is sponsored by Alexander Rosenfeld. Thank you for your sponsorship. If you would like to sponsor an Amud or a daf, see the description box below, and see the description box below to see how you can support this channel. And the Gemara here continues bringing a proof from our Mishnah. This is a proof in terms of the Machlokas Amoraim in the previous Amud. There was a Machlokas Amoraim in the previous Amud. Let's say a person digs a pit in his property, but there's no pit in the other property. Do you still have to distance away from the boundary of the property or not? And so again, the Gemara is in the middle of bringing a proof from the Mishnah. The Mishnah said you have to distance hamelach v'yasasid, you have to distance the salt and the lime v'yasasloim and the rocks mikoslo shel chaveiro gimel tvachim, from the wall of his friend 3 tvachim, osad besid, or he plasters it with lime. And so the Gemara says taima deika kosel. So the inference we can make from the Mishnah is the only reason you have to distance all of these damaging items from your neighbor is because there is a wall there. Haleka kosel somach. It sounds like if there's no wall, you can go right up to the boundary. Again, that sounds like Abaya and not like Rav in the previous Amud. And the Gemara says, lo no, kileka kosel nami lo samach. It could be when there's no wall also, you're not allowed to go right up to the boundary. And the Gemara says, V'ela mai kamashmalan, but if that's the case, what is it teaching us? Ha-kamashmalan, it's teaching us dahani kashu lekosel, that these are difficult, these items are damaging to a wall. In other words, that's why we're mentioning koslo shel chavero, simply to say that these items listed in the Mishnah are damaging to a wall, but it's still, you have to distance oneself. It could be, you have to distance yourself, even in a situation where there is no wall. And the Gemara continues, Tashma, coming here, another proof from the Mishnah. The Mishnah said, Marchikim es hazroim ves hamachresha, ves meiraglayim en hakosel shlosha tvachim. It says you have to distance the seeds and the plowing and the urine from the wall 3 tvachim. And again, the Gemara says, Taima dika kosel. The reason why you have to distance is because there is a wall. Haleka kosel, but if there's no wall, samach, it sounds like you can go right up to the boundary. And the Gemara again says, Lo no, kileka kosel nami lo samach. It could be even without a wall, you're not able to go right up to the boundary. Ve'elamai kamash malon. So what is the Mishnah teaching in this line? HaKamash malon, it's teaching the misunta kasha lekosel, that misunta, as Rashi says, misunta davar lach, something that is moist, is going to be harmful to the wall. And the Gemara continues, Tashma, coming here, another proof from the Mishnah. Vesarechaim, it says you have to distance the mill. Gimel min hashechev, shein dalin min arechev. It has to be 3 tvachim distanced from the lower part of the mill, which is 4 tvachim from the upper part, from the upper stone. And again, the Gemara says, Taima dika kosel. Again, the only reason you have to distance this mill is because there's a wall on the other side. Haleka kosel samach, but if there is no wall, you can go right up to the boundary. And the Gemara says, Lo no, kileka kosel nami lo samach. Again, it could be even without a wall, you're not allowed to go right up to the boundary. V'elamai kamashmalan, and what's it teaching us? Ha-kamashmalan, it's teaching the tirya kasha lekosel, that vibrations are harmful to a wall. And the Gemara continues, Tashma, coming here, another proof from the Mishnah, V'yasat tanur, it says you have to distance the oven, shloshim min akalya shein dalid min hasafa. It has to be 3 tvachim away from the base, which is 4 tvachim away from the upper rim. Taima dika kosel, again, the whole reason you have to distance is because there is a wall, haleka kosel samich, but if there is no wall, so then you can go right up to the boundary. And again, the Gemara says, Lo no, kileka kosel nami lo samich. It could be even without a wall, you can't go right up to the boundary. Elamai kamash malan, rather, what is the Mishnah teaching us? Ha-kamash malan is teaching us the havla kasha lekosel, that the heat is harmful to the wall. And the Gemara continues, Tashma, coming here, a proof from a Mishnah coming up. Lo yiftach adam chanus shel nachtum, and a person cannot open a store of a baker, of a shel tzavoin, or of a dyer, tachas otzaro shel chaveru, underneath of the storehouse of his friend, velo refes bakar, and similarly you can't have a barn for cattle. And the Gemara again says, Taima deika otzer, the reason why it's a problem is because there is this storehouse. The storehouse is already there. Haleka otzer avid, but if there is no otzer, there's no storehouse, he's able to make it. And again, it sounds like if there's nothing there that it's damaging, you can go right up to the boundary. And the Gemara says, Di Rashani, no, it's different by living quarters. When you're talking about opening something up that involves living quarters, it's more permissible. And the Gemara says, Dekanami, we can infer this as well, the Tani Allah, because there's a brisa on the Mishnah that says, Im haisa refes bakar kodemes laotzer, that if the barn for the cattle came before the storehouse, mutter, it's mutter, and that's because it's a dira, that's because it's living quarters. By living quarters, people are allowed to use it for whatever they want if the damage is not right there, right in front of us. And Rashi explains, Chanus shel nachtomin means, again, a store of a baker. Mochrei lechem, it means they sell bread. Shemasikin sham or tamid, there's always a fire lit over there. Otzer is aliyah she'otzrin batzvua, that's like an upper floor where they're gathering, they're storing the grain, v'shemen v'yayin, or oil, or wine, v'ha'ashan kasha lehen. The point is that the smoke is bad for them. V'lo refes bakar, also you can't have a barn for cattle, hareach kasha lehen, because the smell is bad. And so again, it sounds like only if there is an otzer mutter, it's a problem. Otherwise, it's not a problem. And the Gemara says that's true, but di rashani, by living quarters, it's different. Chanus, verefes, bakar. If you're talking about a store, you're talking about a barn. Di rason shal adam hein, that's considered living quarters of people. V'ein lanu les or di raso olav. We're not allowed to forbid, or we shouldn't forbid in terms of what you want to use your living quarters for. Elam kena hezek muchan, unless the damage is right there in front of us. Otherwise, we're lenient. Dekonami di rashani, we can infer as well that living quarters are different to katani Allah, because there's a brisa on the Mishnah which says, Tahi, on that very Mishnah, the brisa says, Im hoisa refes bakar kodemes laotzar. If the barn, if that came before the storehouse, mutter, it's mutter. Uvekulu shar chakos demasnisa. Now, in all the other cases of distancing in the Mishnah, lo tanahachi, you don't find any brisa like that. Shmami nahachi, you see that over here specifically, mishum dedi rashani, we have this brisa because we're trying to say that living quarters are different. Aval inach afarishan tzarich laharchik. But it could be in the other cases, even the person is there first, he still has to distance himself. And the Gemara continues, Tashma, come in here, another proof from a Mishnah later on. Lo yita adam ilan samach lasad, the person can't plant a tree near the field of his friend, ela im kain hirchig mimenu dalet amos, unless he distances himself 4 amos. Betani Allah, and it was learned in a brisa on that Mishnah, dalet amos shamra, when they say you have to distance 4 amos, kidei avodas hakerem, it's in order to leave enough space for the person to work the vineyard. And so the Gemara draws the following inference: Taimud mishum kidei avodas hakerem, the reason why you have to distance is in order to leave enough space to work the vineyard. Halav mishum kidei avodas hakerem, but if not for the fact of working the vineyard, samach, he could go right up to the boundary. V'afagav deika shorashin dekamaski, even though there are roots that are going to cause damage, but still it sounds like you're allowed to go right up to the boundary of the other field. And the Gemara answers, Hacha b'mayaskin, and here what are we talking about? The mafsik tzunma, we're talking about a situation where there is a rock, meaning to say a rock under the ground that stops the roots from causing damage, and that's why it's okay in this case. And the Gemara continues, and we'll learn this with the gears of the Mesoras Hashas. Tashma, come in here, another proof. The Mishnah says later on, Hayageder bein sayim, if there was a fence between the two fields, Zeh somech legeder mikan, v'zeh somech legeder mikan, this one can go all the way up to the fence, and the other one can go all the way up to the fence. And with the Mesoras Hashas' gear, so the Gemara gives the same answer. Hachanami b'tsunma, here also we're talking about a situation where there's a rock that stops the roots from causing damage. But the Gemara says to that, if so, ema seifa, let's look at the end of the Mishnah. It says, Hayusha rasha v'yotzin b'soch shel chaveru, if his roots are going into the field of his neighbor, mamik lohen shlosha tvachim, so the neighbor is allowed to dig 3 tvachim into the earth. He can dig and uproot those roots, kedei shelo ya'akev hamachresha, so that the roots shouldn't prevent him from being able to plow. V'idam afsik tzunma, if you're going to say again, this Mishnah is talking where there's a rock and there are no roots, so my bohasam, what are the roots doing over there? There shouldn't be any roots. And the Gemara says, Hachi Kamar, this is what it's saying, V'ilav tzunma, the Mishnah is going on to say, if there is no rock, V'hayu sharash of yotzin l'soch shel chavero, and his roots are going into his friend's property, Ma'mik shlosha tvachim, you can dig down 3 tvachim, uprooting those roots, Kedei shelo ya'akev ha'machresh, in order that they don't hold back the plow. And Rashi explains, Elem ken hirchik mimenu 4 amos, he has to be 4 amos away, Kedem eforish time, as the reason is given, Kedei avodas hakerem, enough space to work the vineyard, Shayu chorshim hakerem b'machresh, they would use a plow to plow the vineyard. V'chein b'shas habatzer, also at the time of the harvesting. Botzr no son ba'agolos, again they would gather, they would harvest with these wagons. V'tzarch len mokom ponei 4 amos, and they needed space of 4 amos. Shlo tikonis eglas machrishoso bekarka chaveru, so that he wouldn't enter into the land of the neighbor when he was doing that. Time mishum avodas hakerem, and so the reason why there has to be this distance is because he's working the vineyard. Shu maziko biyadayim, meaning he's damaging him actively. Halav, but if not for that, samach, he could go right up against the boundary. V'afagav, and even though we're going to say disofo sheyispashtu sharashav, that in the end there's going to be a different kind of damage. The roots are going to go. V'yaziku besada, they'll cause damage in the field. Bein la'akev hamachresha, whether that holds back the plow. Bein l'chafir sabor, whether for digging a pit. So again, you see that's not a problem. You can go right up to the boundary in that situation because there is no pit as of yet. And the Gemara answered at Sunma, the Gemara said, we're talking where there's Selah Chazak, there's a rock there that separates the properties, Shalo Yispashtu Sharashav Lasham, it stops the roots from going going from one property to the other. That's what we're talking about in the Mishnah. And then the Gemara brought another proof, Geder Bein Sayim. It said in the Mishnah that if there's a fence between, She'ein Maziko Od La'avodas HaKerem. Here you don't have a problem. Once there's a fence, there's no problem of damaging him from working his vineyard. So Zeh Somech Ilonos Legeder Mikan. So then you can put the tree all the way up to the fence on this side. V'Zeh Somech Ilonos Legeder Mikan. The other one also, the tree's all the way up to the fence. V'Inami Echad Me'en Sadeh Loven. Let's say one of them is not an orchard, it's just a field. Ein Kan Kilayim. It's not a problem of Kilayim because of the fence. Kediyamar Be'erevin, like we say in Erevin, Im Gefanim and Mikan, Mutar Lizroa Kan. If you have vines here, you could still plant over there. Gabe Noatzar Bekundasin U'Masach Zemor Al Gabein. The Dami L'Tzuras HaPesach. They have a case over there where it's as if you're making a Tzuras HaPesach. It looks like a doorway. Katani Mia Zeh Somech. So whatever the case is, it says you can go all the way up to the fence. V'Alfa Gav Da'azli Sharashim Tachas HaGeder. Even though the roots will go under the fence, U'Mispashtin L'Soch HaSada, they're going to spread into the field. And then it said that if the roots do go into the field, Ma'amik Lehen Bal HaSada Kotzitz Etz HaSharashim. The owner of the field can cut those roots. Sheyatzu B'Sadeh. He can cut those roots that went into his field. But Omek Shlosha Tvachim, he can cut them to a depth of 3 Tvachim. And finally, Rashi says, V'Lav Tzunma, the interpretation of the Mishnah is that if there is no rock, V'Zen Notei Hasham Shelo Kados, and this person is planting there and he shouldn't have been planting, Ma'amik Lehu Zeh Kashi Haziko Hein. Again, this person is allowed to uproot those roots in order to prevent that damage. And the Gemara continues, Tashma, coming here, another proof from the Mishnah later on. Marchikin es ha'ilan min abor esrim v'chamesh amos. We distance the tree from the pit 25 amos. And the Gemara says, Taima d'ikabor. Again, the only reason you have to distance is because there is a pit. Halekabor samach. It sounds like if there's no pit, he can go right up to the boundary. And the Gemara says, Lo no, ki lekabor nami lo samach. Even if there's no pit, he's not allowed to go right up to the boundary. V'hakamash malon. The Mishnah is simply teaching us da'ad chafayamo azli sharashim umazki labor, that the sharashim, the roots, they can travel up to 25 amos and damage a pit. But the Gemara says, Yachi, if so, Ema Seifel, let's look at the end of the Mishnah. Vim ilon kadam lo yakutz. It says that if the tree was there first, you don't have to cut it down. V'ida lo samech. Now, if the halacha is you're not allowed to go all the way up to the boundary, even if there's no pit there, so hechi mashkachas. So what exactly is the Mishnah talking about when it says the tree came first? There is no such a situation of the tree coming first. And the Gemara answers, Kedamar Rapapa, it's like Rapapa said in a different context, Belokeach, we're talking about a buyer. Hachanami here also in this Mishnah, Belokeach, we're talking about a buyer. And Rashi explains, it says again, look at the end of the Mishnah, if the tree came first, you don't cut it down. Now, if he didn't have it right up to the boundary, what's the case? How exactly did the tree get there first? If he did it, and it was improper, it was against halacha that he went right up to the boundary, why shouldn't you cut down the tree? Mali bor kadam, what difference does it make what came first? The katani code says that the pit comes first, then you do cut it down. Why would it be that you don't cut it down when the tree came first? And the Gemara answers, Kedamar Rapapa, it could be the end of the Mishnah is talking like Rapapa says, Lakaman B'Shmaitin later on in the Sugi in a different context. It could be a particular situation, Hachanami Belokeach, the particular situation of a buyer. The case is, Adam Shanota Ilan B'Soch Sadeo. The case would be, a person planted a tree in his field, V'achar Kach Mochar Chatzi Sadeo Lishachar, then he sold half of his field to someone else, Ubahalokeach V'chafar Bor, and the buyer goes ahead and digs a pit. So there, Ein Zatzarach Lakotzilan, there he doesn't have to cut down his tree, Shanoto B'Reshusa, that he planted in his Reshus, because he had total permission to plant that tree. And the Gemara continues, Tashma, coming here, another proof from a Mishnah later on. Marchikin es ha-mishra min ha-yorok, you have to distance the Mishra, which is the water which you soak the flax in, you have to distance that from the vegetables. V'es ha-kreishin min ha-bitzolin, and the leeks from the onions. V'es ha-chardal min ha-devorim, and the mustard seeds from the bees. And the Gemara says, Taim madika yerok, the reason why you have to distance is because the vegetable is over there. Haleka yerok, it sounds like if there's no vegetable, samach, you can go right up to the boundary. And the Gemara says, Lo no, ki leka yerek nami lo samach, even if there's no vegetable, you're not allowed to go right up to the boundary. V'akamashmalan is teaching us, Dahani kashu adari, that these items, they damage one another. The Gemara says, Yachi, if so, Masefel, let's look at the end of the Mishnah. Rabbi Yossi mater bechardal, it says that Rabbi Yossi says it's okay by the case of the mustard. Again, that's talking about the mustard that you had to distance from the bees. Because he can say to him, instead of you telling me to have my mustard stay away from your bees, maybe your bees need to stay away from my mustard, because they're coming and they're eating my mustard plants. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Yud Ches Amud Beis.